There comes a time in life when heaven goes quiet. You pray, you cry, you seek, but it feels like God is nowhere to be found. And if you're not careful, the silence will make you question everything, your purpose, your calling, even your faith. But I came here to tell you, just because God is silent doesn't mean he's absent. When God goes silent, the natural response is to assume he is absent. We cry out in prayer, we seek answers, and when nothing comes, frustration begins to rise. But the silence of God is not an abandonment. It is a process. It is in these quiet seasons that God is doing his deepest work within us. He is not ignoring us. He is refining us. He is preparing us for what we cannot yet see. Look at the life of Moses. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace, privileged and educated, but when he tried to step into his calling too soon, things fell apart. He killed an Egyptian, fled into the wilderness, and for 40 years he lived in silence. No signs, no miracles, no great calling, just the desert. But in that silence, God was preparing him. He wasn't just making Moses into a leader. He was making him into a man who could carry the weight of a nation's deliverance. The silence was not punishment. It was preparation for the Red Sea moment, for the 10 Commandments, for the history-making journey that would change generations. Sometimes God pulls us into seasons of silence because he is working on something in us that cannot be developed in the noise. When everything is loud, we lean on our own understanding. We rely on distractions, on opinions, on confirmation from people. But in silence, God strips all of that away. He removes the crutches we've been leaning on so that we can learn to lean on him. It's uncomfortable. It's unsettling, but it's necessary. Think about David. He was anointed as king as a young boy, but he didn't step into the throne immediately. Instead, he went back to tending sheep. Can you imagine that? A prophet has just declared that you are the next king of Israel, yet your reality is standing in a field watching over animals. The silence must have felt like a contradiction to the promise. But what David didn't know was that the pasture was preparing him for the palace. The battles he fought in the wilderness, the lions, the bears, were training grounds for the day he would stand before Goliath. If David had never faced the silence of the field, he would have never had the faith to face the giant. Sometimes, God has to take you through a silent season before he can trust you with a public victory. The silence isn't wasted. It's molding you, strengthening you, deepening your roots so that when the breakthrough comes, you won't be shaken by it. Too often we want the blessing, but we don't want the preparation. We want the promotion without the process. But God knows that if he gives it to us too soon, we won't be ready to handle it. Look at Jesus himself. Before he began his public ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness. It was a season of testing, of silence, of being alone with the Father. No crowds, no miracles, just silence. The Son of God, the Messiah, the one who carried all power in his hands, still had to go through a season of preparation before stepping into his divine assignment. The silence is where God removes distractions. It's where he prunes away what is unnecessary. It's where he builds character. You cannot walk into a promised land with a wilderness mindset. You cannot carry a crown with a heart that is unprepared. God's silence is often his way of making sure that when the door finally opens, you will be ready to walk through it. Faith is not built in the moments when everything is clear, when the path is well lit, and when God is speaking loudly. Faith is forged in the places where questions outweigh answers, where prayers seem to echo into nothingness, and where silence stretches longer than expected. It is in the quiet places, those deep, uncertain, and often painful seasons, that faith is tested, stretched, and strengthened. Consider Abraham, the father of faith. God made him a promise, descendants as numerous as the stars, a legacy that would bless the entire world. But after that promise, what followed? Years of silence. Years where nothing seemed to change. Years where his wife remained barren, where his body aged, where doubt could have easily crept in. Faith was not built when God first spoke. Faith was built in the years of waiting, in the nights when the stars looked like mockery instead of a promise. Every day that passed without a sign of fulfillment was an opportunity for faith to grow or for doubt to take over. Faith is not simply believing when things are going well. That's easy. True faith is believing when nothing makes sense, when the silence of God seems deafening, when there is no visible proof that things will work out. It's standing firm when everything in you wants to give up, when logic says it's impossible, when emotions say it's hopeless. It's in those quiet places that faith is either strengthened or shattered. Look at Job, a man who had everything, wealth, family, health, status, and then in an instant it was gone. Not only did he lose everything, but God also went silent. No explanations, no comfort, just loss, pain, and confusion. His friends offered their opinions. His wife told him to curse God and die, and yet Job refused. He chose to trust in the silence, not because he understood what God was doing, but because his faith wasn't built on circumstances. It was built on conviction. The quiet place became the proving ground of his faith. Silence forces us to ask, do we trust God or do we trust what he gives us? Do we trust his character or do we only trust when we see results? It's in the quiet places where God strips away every false foundation, every conditional belief, every shallow trust. He allows the silence to reveal what we really stand on. Because faith is not about what we can see, it's about who we know God to be. Think about the disciples in the storm. They were on a boat, waves crashing, wind howling, fear rising, and where was Jesus? Asleep, silent, not reacting to the panic around him. The disciples thought silence meant indifference. But in reality, silence was an invitation to faith. Jesus had already spoken a word. Let us go to the other side. The silence in the storm was not abandonment. It was an opportunity to trust that his word was enough, that his presence, whether speaking or silent, was still powerful. Silence is a refining fire. It strips away pretense. It forces us to go deeper. It reveals what we truly believe. Some people walk away when God is silent because their faith was never in him. It was in his answers. But those who stay, those who press through the quiet places, find something greater. They find a faith that is unshakable, a trust that is not dependent on external signs, and a confidence that remains even when heaven seems still. One of the hardest lessons in faith is understanding that God's timing is not our timing. When we pray, when we seek, when we step out in faith, we expect things to happen immediately. But God doesn't operate on human schedules. He moves according to his divine purpose, and often that means what looks like a delay to us is actually perfect timing in his plan. The challenge is that when the answer doesn't come when we expect, we start to assume that God has said no. But just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. A delay is not a denial, it's a preparation. Look at Hannah, the mother of Samuel. She longed for a child, prayed with tears, and endured years of waiting while others around her were blessed. To make matters worse, her rival, Peninnah, mocked her barrenness, making her pain even more unbearable. Every passing year felt like a reminder that her prayers were unanswered. But what she didn't realize was that her delay had a purpose. Samuel wasn't just any child. He was destined to be a prophet, a leader in Israel. If Hannah had received a child earlier, it wouldn't have been Samuel. Her waiting wasn't wasted. It was aligning her with God's perfect will. Think about Lazarus. His sisters, Mary and Martha, sent word to Jesus that he was sick, expecting him to come immediately. But instead, Jesus delayed. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. From their perspective, the delay was a denial. They thought it was over. But Jesus was never late. He was setting the stage for a greater miracle. Had he arrived earlier, he would have healed a sick man, But by waiting, he resurrected a dead man. The delay wasn't about denial, it was about revealing God's glory in a way they never expected. Sometimes we think that because something hasn't happened yet, it never will. But God's silence in your waiting season doesn't mean He has forgotten you. It means He is orchestrating things behind the scenes, aligning details you cannot see, preparing the blessing to come at the right time. If you receive something too soon, before you're ready, before the circumstances are aligned, it may not be the blessing you think it is. Look at Joseph. As a teenager, he had a dream that he would be a ruler, that his family would bow before him. But after that dream, what happened? A pit, slavery, a prison sentence. Every event in his life seemed to move in the opposite direction of the promise. For years, it looked like a denial. But in reality, God was preparing him. Joseph wasn't just meant to rule, he was meant to save a nation. The delay wasn't punishment, it was positioning. By the time he stepped into the palace, he wasn't just a dreamer, he was a man of wisdom, humility, and strength. God's delays are not random, they are strategic. Sometimes he delays things because we are not ready. Sometimes he delays things because the right people aren't in place yet. Sometimes he delays things because there is still a lesson we need to learn before we can handle what he has prepared. The delay is never about depriving you. It's about preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. Trust is not built in the noise, in the moments when everything is clear and God's voice is loud. Trust is built in the moments when you hear nothing, when prayers seem to go unanswered, when the heavens feel closed and yet you choose to believe anyway. Silence is not absence, it is an invitation. An invitation to lean in, to dig deeper, to walk by faith instead of sight. Look at Moses. He spent 40 years in Pharaoh's palace being trained as a leader, only to be sent into the wilderness for another 40 years. That wilderness wasn't just a location, it was a season of silence. A season where God was preparing him to be more than just a leader of Egypt. He was being shaped into a deliverer for Israel. Those years of silence weren't wasted, they were essential. Moses had to learn to trust God without signs, without miracles, without constant reassurance. And because he learned to trust God in the silence, he was able to stand before Pharaoh and declare, "Let my people go," without fear. God's silence tests the foundation of our faith. Do we trust him because we feel him, or do we trust him because we know him? It's easy to believe when you see results, when you hear his voice, when doors open, but real trust is proven when none of that is happening, when prayers are met with silence, when the door stays shut, when everything in you is screaming to give up. Think about David, anointed as king while still a shepherd boy, yet he didn't step into the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, living like an outcast. Where was God in those years? Why wasn't he speaking? Why wasn't he moving? David had to learn that trusting God wasn't about convenience, it was about conviction. He had to trust in the silence, in the hiding, in the waiting. And when the time was right, the silence broke and David walked into his destiny. God's silence forces us to rely on what we already know. Many times we want a fresh word, a new sign, another confirmation. But God has already spoken. He has already given you a promise, already placed a calling on your life, already provided his word. Silence is not a rejection. It's a reminder that you don't need to hear something new when you already have his truth. Think about Jesus on the cross. In his greatest moment of suffering, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, silence was deafening. But did God truly forsake him? No. Heaven was still watching, the plan was still in motion. The silence wasn't abandonment, it was the completion of something greater. Silence is not punishment. It is a season of trust building, a time when God is watching to see if you will stand on his word even when he seems far away. It's a test of whether your faith is in his voice or in his character. Because when you trust God in silence, when you refuse to quit, when you hold on even when you don't understand, you position yourself for something greater. Faith isn't just about believing when everything is going well. Faith is about holding on when nothing makes sense, when doors aren't opening, when you feel like you're walking in the dark. It is in the quiet seasons, the seasons where God seems silent, that faith is stretched, tested, and ultimately strengthened. Look at Abraham. God told him that he would be the father of many nations, but after that promise there was silence. No immediate child, no clear roadmap, just time passing. Year after year, Abraham had to wake up and choose to believe. He had to hold on to what God said, even when it looked impossible. The longer the silence lasted, the more his faith had to grow. And the Bible says in Romans 4:20 that he did not waver through unbelief, but was strengthened in his faith. The silence didn't weaken him, it made him stronger. That's what happens in the quiet seasons. When you don't hear God, you have to stand on what you already know about him. You have to trust his character, his word, his past faithfulness. And in doing that, your faith deepens, because real faith isn't about needing constant reassurance. It's about knowing deep in your spirit that God is still working even when he's quiet. Think about Job. He was a man who walked with God, lived righteously, and yet everything was taken from him. His wealth, his children, his health, and in his suffering, God was silent. Job cried out, questioned, wrestled with his pain, but God didn't answer immediately. Yet, even in the silence, Job didn't turn away. His faith, though tested, didn't break. It grew stronger. Because faith that is tested is faith that is unshakable. God uses silence to develop endurance. In a world that wants instant results, instant answers, instant breakthroughs, God moves differently. He allows us to walk through silent seasons so that our faith doesn't remain shallow. He wants endurance, perseverance, a faith that doesn't crumble when life gets hard. Think about Jesus' disciples in the storm. They were in the boat, the wind was raging, the waves were crashing, and where was Jesus? Asleep, silent. To them, it must have felt like abandonment, but in reality, it was a test. Would they trust what they knew about him, or would they let fear take over? When Jesus finally woke up, he rebuked the storm, but then he turned to them and asked, "Where is your faith?" Because faith isn't just for the moments when everything is calm. Faith is for the moments when it feels like God is sleeping through your storm. Silence forces you to rely on faith, not feelings. Feelings fluctuate. One day you feel strong, the next you feel weak, but faith is steady. Faith is what carries you through the dry seasons, the waiting seasons, the silent seasons. It teaches you to trust God beyond what you can see, beyond what you can hear, beyond what you can feel. Think about Noah. He built an ark for years while the world mocked him. No rain, no signs, just obedience. That's what faith looks like. Building when there's no evidence, preparing when there's no confirmation, trusting when there's only silence. Because in the quiet seasons, God isn't absent. He's strengthening your faith so that when the rain finally comes, you're ready. Silence can feel like abandonment. When prayers go unanswered, when life feels heavy, when all you hear is nothing, it's easy to think that God has stepped away. But silence does not mean God is absent. His silence is not his departure, it's his process. Look at Joseph. God gave him a dream that he would be a ruler, yet after that dream, his life took a downward spiral. Betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, locked in prison. Where was God in all of this? There were no angelic visits, no divine explanations, no clear signs, just silence. But what looked like abandonment was actually preparation. God was not absent in Joseph's silence. He was working behind the scenes, aligning every detail for Joseph's promotion. This is how God moves. Just because you can't see him, just because you don't hear him, doesn't mean he's not orchestrating something greater than you can imagine. Silence is often the stage where God does his greatest work. Think about Esther. An orphan girl taken into a foreign palace surrounded by enemies. Nowhere in the book of Esther do we see God speaking. There are no recorded visions, no angelic encounters, no audible voices from heaven. And yet God's hand is in every detail. He was positioning her, placing her in the palace, setting up a divine rescue plan. Even when God's voice was absent, his presence was evident. God's silence is a test of trust. It's easy to believe when miracles happen, when prayers are answered, when doors open. But can you trust him when the heavens are quiet? Can you trust that even when you don't hear him, he's still there? Look at Jesus in the tomb. For 3 days, silence. The disciples were confused, afraid, grieving. It looked like God had abandoned his son. But was he absent? No. In that silence, God was fulfilling the greatest redemption plan in history. God's silence doesn't mean he's left. It means he's watching. A teacher doesn't talk during the test. Silence is often the evidence that you're in a season of testing, a season where your faith has to stand, where what you've learned has to be lived. The question is, will you trust what he already told you, or will you let the silence shake you? Think about Daniel in the lion's den, thrown into danger, left alone overnight, no angelic voice telling him what would happen, no immediate rescue, just silence. But was God absent? No. When morning came, the lions had not touched him. God's silence didn't mean he wasn't working. It meant he had already secured Daniel's victory before the night even began. God's silence is strategic. Sometimes he is silent because he is shifting things. He is preparing people, moving obstacles, aligning breakthroughs. Sometimes he is silent because he wants to see if you will rely on his word instead of needing constant signs. And sometimes he is silent because he wants you to seek him more deeply. Think about Mary and Martha when Lazarus died. They sent word to Jesus, expecting him to come immediately, but he delayed. He was silent, and in that silence, Lazarus died. To them, it looked like Jesus had abandoned them, but in reality, his silence wasn't rejection, it was a setup for a greater miracle. If Jesus had spoken too soon, they would have seen a healing. But because he was silent, they saw a resurrection. Silence is never emptiness. It is never abandonment. It is the space where God moves in ways beyond human understanding. Silence is never the absence of God. It is the proving ground of faith. It is in the stillness, in the waiting, in the unanswered prayers that our trust is refined. God's silence is not his neglect. It is his strategy. When God is silent, he is strengthening you. He is preparing you for what you cannot yet see. He is aligning circumstances, shifting obstacles, building endurance. What looks like a delay is often divine positioning. Think about the stories we've walked through: Joseph in the prison, Job in his suffering, Esther in the palace, Daniel in the lion's den, Jesus in the tomb. In every situation, silence was not the end of the story. It was the setup for something greater. So when you can't hear him, hold on to what he already told you. When you don't see movement, trust that he is working beneath the surface. When you feel alone, remember that he has never left your side. Faith isn't built in the noise, it's built in the quiet. Keep walking, keep believing, keep trusting, because when God finally speaks, when he finally moves, when he finally reveals what he was doing all along, you will see that the silence was never empty. It was full of his presence, his power, and his perfect plan.